Hey guys, tonight we begin with something more cheerful than plagues or pig farming. We're stepping into a medieval wedding with no tuxedos, diamond rings, or dance floor. But somehow, people still manage to get married, celebrate, and feed half the village. We'll explore a typical wedding for regular folk in the Middle Ages tonight. No royalty, no dramatic romance. Just a couple hoping to survive the winter and maybe raise a few kids who didn't immediately run off to become monks or mercenaries. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to see who's joining this sleepy journey from all over the world. Now turn off the lights, switch on a soft fan if you enjoy a gentle hum, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. In a medieval village, there were no formal invitations. People found out about a wedding the same way they found out everything else. By word of mouth. Someone mentioned it while fetching water. Someone else passed it on during market day, and pretty soon the entire village knew there'd be a wedding by the end of the week. There was no fixed season for getting married, but couples usually picked a time that worked around planting, harvesting, or religious holidays. Spring and summer were popular, partly because it was warmer and partly because that's when food was more available. And while modern weddings can take months or years to plan, a medieval peasant wedding might come together in just a few days. You didn't need to book a venue. You just needed to find a dry patch of ground and a priest who wasn't too busy. The bride didn't wear a white dress. That tradition came much later. She wore her best clothes, usually something she already owned. Maybe a tunic that had been carefully cleaned and patched, with a belt or head covering to dress it up. The groom, much the same. He'd shave, maybe wash his face, and wear the tunic he didn't use for farm work. If he had boots, he wore them. If not, bare feet were fine. No one expected anyone to look like a noble. They just had to look clean and awake. Flowers might be gathered from the field to make a small bouquet or a garland. Not fancy, but thoughtful. The ceremony itself was simple. If a priest were available, he'd say a few words, bless the couple, and ensure everyone witnessed the vows. In some areas, just declaring your intent in front of witnesses was enough. There were no rings for most peasants. Maybe a token gift was exchanged. Something practical, like a small coin or a piece of cloth. What mattered most was mutual agreement, spoken aloud in front of others. And once the vows were said, that was it. No long speeches, no elaborate music, a cheer from the crowd and a quick prayer that the couple would have healthy children and not starve over winter. The reception was where things got interesting. Everyone brought something if they could, bread, vegetables, and maybe some cheese or ale. The food was shared, the drinks were passed around, and people sat wherever they could. Benches, logs, or the grass, whatever worked. There might be music if someone had a drum or a flute. More often, it was just singing, clapping, and people stomping their feet in rhythm. Dancing wasn't choreographed, it was energetic, spontaneous, and usually involved some tripping. But no one minded. Children ran around. Dogs occasionally joined the festivities. People laughed, talked, and enjoyed having something to celebrate that wasn't a harvest or a religious festival. It was one of the few days when work could be set aside and the community could relax. The wedding didn't always end with sunset. Some went on into the night, especially if enough ale kept the guests warm and chatty. Stories were told, simple games played, and sometimes a neighbor would bring out a fiddle or pipe and keep the music going. There wasn't a honeymoon, just a quiet walk home, maybe to a shared cottage or a room prepared by the bride's family. Privacy wasn't always guaranteed, but people made do. Life wasn't easy, but weddings reminded everyone that happiness was still possible, even for a day. In the days that followed, the newlyweds settled into everyday life. There were no name changes, no paperwork, and no thank you cards. They got back to work, planting, weaving, tending animals. But now they did it together. And for all the simplicity, there was meaning. Weddings weren't about display. They were about building a life, starting a household, and becoming part of the village in a new way. And for most couples, that was enough. Now, as you rest, picture a small village green with a few tables, mismatched bowls, and people laughing around a fire. No one's checking their phone. No one's worried about seating charts. Just a group of neighbors enjoying a rare moment of joy. You hear footsteps on soft dirt, the crackle of bread crust, the quiet clink of a wooden mug being passed from hand to hand. You settle deeper into your blanket, knowing that even in the most challenging times, people knew how to come together for one night. And just like that, the wedding fades into memory. A small, happy moment in a world that rarely paused. But tonight we paused with it, and it feels just right. In medieval times, most weddings didn't begin with love at first sight. They started with dinner, or more specifically, with two families sharing food, exchanging goods, and deciding whether your goats and their grain made a good match. For most peasants, marriage wasn't about romance. It was a practical agreement. Families needed help on the farm, someone to pass down the tools, or just an extra set of hands to keep the fire and the animals alive. If affection grew over time, that was nice. But it wasn't expected. What mattered more was, could this person work? Can they carry water, chop wood, tend the chickens, and keep quiet about your snoring? If yes, congratulations. You were marriage material. Most young people didn't choose their partner alone. Parents played a significant role. A father might ask around the village, "So your daughter, does she know how to spin wool?" Or a mother might pull aside her neighbor and say, "My boy needs a wife who doesn't mind pigs." If both sides agreed the match made sense, they'd meet to talk details. Sometimes this was informal, just a conversation over bread and ale. Other times, there was a more formal betrothal, where promises were exchanged in front of witnesses. This wasn't legally binding, but breaking it could cause hard feelings. And in a small village, hard feelings were hard to avoid. Unlike nobles, peasants didn't deal with large dowries or land transfers. But something was usually exchanged. Maybe a few chickens, a grain sack, or a sturdy cooking pot. It wasn't about wealth. It was about goodwill and balance. If a groom's family had more animals, the bride's family might offer tools or woven cloth. It didn't have to be equal, just reasonable. Everyone knew what the other had. No one expected gold, but if you had an extra jug of good cider, that could sweeten the deal. Once things were settled, the couple might have a short period of courtship. But don't picture long walks by the river or love letters hidden in tree trunks. This courtship usually meant working side by side in the fields, maybe chatting while carrying buckets or tending sheep. It was a chance to observe each other, how they handled hard work, talked, and behaved with family. Did he complain all the time? Did she throw things when annoyed? These were the things people noticed. These were the things that mattered. If they got along, great. If not, well, the match might still go forward anyway. In some areas, local customs allowed for more say from the couple. A girl could refuse a suitor, especially if he was rude, much older, or had a reputation for being lazy. However, pressure from family or community was standard. People were expected to marry young, especially women. By age 14 or 15, a girl might already be considered of marriage age. Boys a little older, around 16 to 20, when they were strong enough to work a field or manage livestock. Childhood wasn't long, and marriage was often seen as the start of real adulthood. And for some couples, yes, love did happen. They might smile a little more than usual. They might save the best apple or share a slice of cheese. Quiet gestures that meant something. Love wasn't loud, but it showed up in small ways. Still, even then, they had to be careful. Unmarried couples seen spending too much time together could face gossip, suspicion, or worse, pressure to marry immediately. Reputation mattered. A nasty rumor could affect a girl's chances of finding a husband, or a boy's chances of finding work. One thing almost everyone agreed on: marriage meant responsibility. Once the vows were said, that was it. You shared your home, food, sleep space, and worries. You worked together and raised children. If one got sick, the other kept everything going. There was no his chores and her chores. Just chores. If the roof leaked, someone had to fix it. If the goat escaped, someone had to chase it. Whether it was the husband or wife depended more on who had free hands at the moment than anything else. Of course, not all matches were fair. Some were rushed, some were made out of convenience. And some, especially if one family owed the other a favor, were expected to happen, regardless of how the couple felt. But once the marriage was done, most people did their best. Survival required cooperation, and over time, many couples developed trust, familiarity, and sometimes even affection. Not always dramatic, not always poetic, but steady. You knew each other's habits. You knew who snored, who hated turnips, and who remembered to bank the fire before bed. That kind of steady partnership could be a great comfort in a world of uncertainty. And so, marriage in the medieval village wasn't about fireworks or fairy tales. It was about finding someone to share the work, the stew, the bed, and the brutal winters. It was about making life a little more manageable. And sometimes, in the quiet rhythm of daily chores and evening meals, something like love found its way in anyway. In medieval times, marriage didn't just unite two people. It united two households, sometimes two sets of debts, land disputes, and goats with attitude problems. One of the most talked about parts of any marriage arrangement was the dowry. The dowry might include land, coins, or livestock for wealthier families. But for peasants, it was usually more modest. A sturdy blanket, a cooking pot, a few chickens, maybe a piglet if things were going well that year. No matter the size, the dowry mattered. It showed that the bride's family was serious, responsible, and not just trying to unload an extra mouth to feed. It also helped the new couple start their life with something, however small, to build on. Some dowries were written down, others were agreed upon with a handshake and a promise. If there were disputes later, like if someone claimed the goat was pregnant when it wasn't, the whole village might get involved in sorting it out. These things had a way of becoming everyone's business. And yes, there were arguments. Sometimes a father promised more than he could give. Or the groom's family expected a cow but got a chicken with a limp. Feelings were hurt, but in most cases, people found a way to move forward. Life was too short to stay angry over one goat. Usually, it wasn't always about the objects. Skills and labor counted too. Suppose the bride was a skilled spinner or herbalist, which was considered valuable. If the groom had strong arms and a good reputation, that added weight to the match, even if he didn't have a single coin. People talked. They asked around. They remembered who had helped fix a fence during the last storm, who showed up with soup when someone was ill. Kindness and reliability weren't written into contracts, but held value in small communities. In some cases, especially with younger brides, the dowry would be held by a third party, often the groom's father or a village elder, until the marriage seemed secure. The dowry might be returned if the couple separated early, rare but not impossible. But that could get messy, especially if half had already been eaten. And not all dowries were given willingly. Sometimes a girl's family was pressured into a match by economic need or community expectations. Giving up the family's only good blanket was hard. Giving up a daughter with capable hands was harder. But sometimes they felt they had no choice. Conversely, the groom's family might also contribute something, especially a place to live. A corner in the main cottage, an old room, a rebuilt shed. Privacy was limited, but the expectation was clear. Newlyweds needed a roof and a hearth, even if it came with in-laws in every direction. If the groom had no land, tools, or livestock, he might move in with the bride's family instead. This was less common and sometimes joked about quietly behind his back, but it happened. After all, survival came first. Pride came second. The dowry wasn't just a gift, it was a kind of insurance. The dowry might help the widow survive if the husband died or disappeared. It gave her some standing. Some families even wrote down dowry rights in village records if records existed. In theory, it offered some protection. In practice, it depended on who was still alive, who remembered the deal, and whether any witnesses were sober enough to back her up. And while these arrangements might sound cold, they weren't without care. Families wanted their children to marry well, not just for status, but for stability. A good match meant fewer arguments, fewer problems, and more hands to share the work. That mattered more than love songs or grand gestures. It meant there was food on the table, dry firewood by the door, and a partner who didn't leave you alone with the leaky roof and the crying baby. Of course, there were exceptions. Some couples married purely for affection and got by without a dowry. Maybe he built their hut from scratch. Perhaps she raised chickens and traded eggs for cloth. Maybe their families frowned at first, but eventually came around. Those stories were shared quietly, proof that sometimes love could win over logistics. But most of the time, a good solid cooking pot and a reliable pig spoke louder than feelings. And so, dowries became part of the rhythm of village life. When a marriage was announced, people didn't ask, "Are they in love?" They asked, "Did she bring anything useful?" Or, "Does he have room for her at his place?" It might sound unromantic, but it was honest. In a world where every winter was a gamble and every harvest could go wrong, marriages were built on cooperation, not poetry. In medieval Europe, no marriage felt truly official unless the church had something to say. Even if the couple had lived together for a year, raised a pig, and already had 2 children who liked to throw onions at chickens, the priest still had the final word. That's because marriage to the church wasn't just a personal agreement. It was a sacrament, a spiritual commitment made before God. And while everyday life in the village ran on common sense and shared chores, weddings were where faith and ritual stepped in, whether people asked for it or not. For wealthier couples, the ceremony might take place inside the church building. But most peasants didn't have that luxury. Many villages didn't even have a church. Some shared one with neighboring towns. Others had only a traveling priest who came by when he could. So instead of fancy chapels, many marriages were blessed just outside, on the church steps, in the graveyard, or even under a nearby tree. The location didn't matter as much as the presence of a priest and at least a few sober witnesses. The ceremony was short and serious. No grand music, decorative flowers, or "speak now or forever hold your peace." The couple stood facing each other while the priest recited prayers in Latin. They weren't expected to understand the words, to nod at the right moments. The most important part was the exchange of consent. Each person had to agree to the marriage. No mumbling, no silence. If one of them hesitated, the priest might stop the ceremony entirely. Consent mattered, at least in theory. In practice, social pressure could be heavy. Everyone was watching. Families were invested. The food was already being cooked. Saying no wasn't easy. It might be used if a ring were available, but most peasants didn't have one. Instead, they might exchange a token, a coin, a cloth, or a string tied around the wrist. The gesture was more symbolic than legal. Then came the blessing. The priest would say a prayer, cross himself, and sometimes sprinkle a bit of holy water. He might give a short sermon about duty, family, and not yelling during supper if he was in a generous mood. And just like that, the couple was married. Legally, spiritually, officially. Church involvement in weddings wasn't just about the ceremony, it was also about control. The church had rules, lots of them. You couldn't marry certain relatives, even distant ones. You couldn't marry during Lent or Advent. You couldn't marry someone who had already promised to marry someone else, though this happened anyway. There were also rules about public declarations. Marriages were supposed to be announced in advance, often during 3 consecutive Sundays at church, so anyone with objections could speak up. Maybe someone else had already proposed, or perhaps the couple was related and didn't know it, or maybe someone just liked causing trouble. Still, many couples didn't wait for all the formalities. In rural areas, people often married first, then called the priest later when he was nearby. The church didn't love this, but it happened so frequently that priests learned to adapt. Sometimes they blessed a marriage after it had already lasted a year. And as long as the couple stayed together, worked hard, and went to Mass, the priest usually let it slide. Confession played a role too. Before the wedding, the bride and groom were expected to confess their sins and receive communion. This wasn't just spiritual hygiene, it was a way to start married life with a clean slate. For nervous couples, this was a moment to reflect. For the priest, it was also a chance to check for any forgotten promises or unresolved entanglements. It wasn't unheard of for a wedding to be delayed because someone remembered they were technically betrothed to a cousin 3 villages away. Priests also gave advice. Sometimes it was kind. Sometimes it was awkward. They might remind the couple to be faithful, to have children, and to avoid intimacy on certain days. Sundays were off limits, so were feast days, fast days, and long lists of holy days that made married life surprisingly difficult to schedule. These teachings were often taken seriously, but among peasants, practicality usually won. They followed the rules when they could, and quietly ignored them when they couldn't. Of course, not all priests were the same. Some were gentle and understanding, others were stern and easily irritated. A few were barely sober, but most saw weddings as a part of their duty. They believed in helping couples start strong, even if the roof leaked and the bride's veil was just a borrowed handkerchief. After the ceremony, the priest might join the feast. He'd get a seat near the stew pot and a mug of ale. He might bless the food or the fact that it was hot. Then he'd quietly eat, smile politely, and try to leave before someone challenged him to dance. And so, the church stood at the doorway of every marriage, sometimes literally, sometimes symbolically. It watched over the vows, offered guidance, and reminded everyone that a wedding wasn't just about two people. It was also about faith, duty, and the quiet hope that something good could grow from a simple promise. Not all weddings in medieval times looked the same. Perhaps the most charming and chaotic of them all were the rural peasant weddings. No silk gowns, no gold rings, no servants running around with trays of grapes. The entire village showed up with whatever they had and celebrated it. A peasant wedding wasn't about appearance, it was about participation. You didn't need wealth or titles to get married. You required agreement, a witness or two, and preferably someone who could cook. The ceremony often took place outside, maybe under a tree, beside the well, just in front of the bride's house. People gathered on foot, bringing stools or just standing. Kids played in the background. Dogs wandered between people's legs, and someone's uncle always arrived late, carrying a small sack of turnips as a wedding gift. There weren't decorations, but people tried to make things feel special. Someone might pick wildflowers to hang over the door. Others might bring a clean cloth to lay over a table. If there was music, it came from a single flute, a drum made from a stretched hide, or sometimes just clapping and humming. It didn't matter. It was the thought that counted. Guests didn't sit in neat rows. They stood in loose circles, trying to find a spot that wasn't muddy. Someone would call for quiet, usually the loudest woman in the village, and the couple would step forward. No long speeches, just a few words, clear and strong. I take you, and I take you. With nods, sometimes smiles, and often a few chuckles if one stumbled over the words. If a priest were present, he'd offer a blessing. If not, the village elder might say something brief and vaguely religious. Then came a cheer, a clap on the back. And that was that. The couple was now husband and wife, but the real fun started after the vows, the feast. No hired caterers, no elaborate menus. Everyone just brought whatever they had. A loaf of bread, a few apples, a jug of ale. Some stew was kept warm in a pot wrapped in wool. The food was laid out on tables, if there were any, or just on cloths spread on the grass. There were no assigned seats. You sat where you could. If it rained, you moved indoors, squeezing into the largest house or barn. Chickens might be underfoot. The fire might smoke too much. But no one complained. It was a rare day off, a reason to laugh, a reason to eat something better than plain porridge. Dancing wasn't choreographed. It began when someone stood up and started moving their feet. Someone else clapped. A third person joined in. Before long, there was a circle of neighbors stomping and spinning while others cheered them on. Children joined too, usually making up their versions of the dance that involved more falling than rhythm. There were no fancy shoes, just bare feet or worn boots. No ribbons unless someone had saved a bit of cloth. And no one minded if the bride danced while holding a spoon or if the groom had hay in his hair. There were also games, simple, loud, and occasionally dangerous. Races through the field, contests to see who could lift a barrel the longest. A test of who could catch the greased pig, though that often ended with 3 people flat on the ground and the pig victorious. And of course, there was storytelling. The older men pulled out stories they'd told 100 times. The young ones tried to top them with clearly made-up tales. Laughter was constant. So was teasing. Someone always made fun of the groom's hair or the bride's cooking, but it was all in good spirit. Gifts weren't wrapped. No boxes with bows. Just practical items handed over with a nod. A spare wool blanket, a loaf of rye bread, a wooden ladle, a tin of salt, maybe a carved comb or a stitched apron. Things meant to be used, not admired. If someone had nothing to give, they gave time, helping to clean up, watching the younger kids, or mending a fence the next day. That counted too. At some point, someone would start singing an old wedding song. The words changed from village to village, but the melody stayed familiar. Soft, steady, and easy enough for everyone to join. People sang while eating, while cleaning, and sometimes while half asleep. The newlyweds didn't leave for a honeymoon. They stayed sitting together, smiling quietly. Tired, maybe overwhelmed, but content. They'd be back tomorrow to chop wood, milk goats, and argue about firewood. But for tonight, they had just celebrated. The feast usually ended when the fire died down or the ale ran out, whichever came first. People drifted off slowly, thanking the hosts, patting the groom on the back, and reminding the bride to get some sleep. Children were carried home wrapped in shawls. The last bits of bread were tucked into pockets for breakfast, and when the village finally fell quiet, the stars above looked the same as always. But for the couple now lying under a shared roof, the world had shifted, just a little. 2 lives, now 1. 2 paths, now walking side by side. Not every wedding in the Middle Ages was humble or quiet. For noble families, marriage wasn't just personal. It was political. A union between 2 households could mean land, alliances, power, or peace. And the wedding ceremony reflected that. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a performance. Imagine the opposite of a peasant feast. No shared stew in a clay pot, no barefoot dancing on grass. Instead, picture stone halls draped with embroidered banners, tables overflowing with roasted meats, and guests dressed in their finest wool, silk, or whatever their rank could afford. Noble weddings were planned carefully, often months or years in advance. Matches were arranged not by the couple, but by parents, guardians, or even monarchs. A young lord might be promised to a lady before he could hold a sword. A noble girl could be engaged before she turned 12. The reasons were rarely romantic. A disputed border, marry into the neighboring family, a cousin with too much land, marry her off to a loyal knight, a dowry large enough to repair a crumbling castle. That's the bride we want. In these circles, love came later, if at all. When the wedding day arrived, the guests were many and essential. Other nobles, church officials, merchants, and anyone with enough status to warrant a seat. Sometimes the king sent a representative, especially if the family was powerful. Everyone watched, everyone judged. The bride wore her best gown, often brightly colored and heavily embroidered. White wasn't a tradition yet. Blue and red were popular. Her sleeves might be wide enough to catch a breeze, and her belt might be decorated with small coins or beads. A veil would be trimmed with lace or even gold thread if she had a veil. She might not smile much. That didn't mean she was unhappy. It just wasn't expected. The groom usually wore a long tunic with a finely made surcoat, his family's colors sewn across the chest. His shoes were polished, his beard was trimmed. He stood tall, even if he was nervous about whether or not this wedding could change everything for his family's future. And unlike village weddings, noble ceremonies often happened inside a church, not outside on the steps, but beneath vaulted ceilings and stained glass, with incense and candlelight. The priest didn't rush. He gave a whole sermon. Sometimes 2. Vows were spoken clearly, in front of a large crowd. Rings were exchanged if the families could afford them. Sometimes more than 1 ring of gold is set with small stones, or engraved with initials. After the ceremony, the celebration began, and it was no simple meal. There was music, real musicians playing lutes, harps, and flutes. There were dishes served in courses, soups, stews, roasted birds, fish, pastries, and sweetmeats. If it was a particularly grand affair, swans or peacocks might be on the table, their feathers cleaned and set upright after cooking, more for show than flavor. Servants moved constantly, refilling mugs, clearing bones, wiping spills. The high table, where the couple and the most critical guests sat, was raised on a small platform. Everyone could see them, everything they did mattered. Guests were expected to behave with manners. No shouting, no grabbing food, no falling asleep at the table, even if the priest's speech had gone on long. Laughter was allowed, but only in the right places. This wasn't a village gathering, it was a social stage. There were dances, but they were more formal. Partners bowed, hands barely touched, movements were practiced and graceful. It wasn't about wild celebration, but about control, elegance, and appearing noble, even while stepping over spilled gravy. But behind the appearances, people still whispered. Who looked unhappy? Whose gift was too small? Who drank too much? Who might be marrying next? The couple didn't sneak off early. That came later. For now they were watched, toasted, and sometimes expected to give short speeches or receive blessings from family elders. They ate carefully, drank just enough, and tried not to show if their shoes were pinching. And while guests feasted, deals were quietly discussed in corners. Now that we're family was a standard opening line. A wedding might change land ownership, bring peace between rival houses, or arrange the next generation's marriage in advance. This was business, wrapped in music and wine. Eventually, the evening wound down. The couple was escorted, sometimes with candles, sometimes with teasing, toward their chambers. It was not always private. A witness stood by in some places to confirm the marriage had been completed. This wasn't romantic. It was legal. Afterward, the doors were closed, the candles dimmed, and the guests slowly departed or found places to sleep within the manor. The wedding celebrations might continue the next day for nobles who could afford it. Another feast, more dancing, a hunting party. Gifts are exchanged between households. Some weddings stretched several days, especially if essential guests had traveled far. And when it finally ended, the castle grew quiet. The musicians packed up. The servants began cleaning. The bride folded her gown. The groom removed his crest. And while it looked magnificent, the food, the banners, the music, in the end, it was still just two people, now joined, facing a life together with all its expectations. In the Middle Ages, choosing a wedding date wasn't just convenient. It was a careful dance between church calendars, farming seasons, and superstitions passed down through generations. If you thought planning around relatives was tricky, try planning around saints, soil, and the moon. The church had strong opinions about when couples should or shouldn't get married. Entire stretches of the year were off limits. You couldn't marry during Lent, which was over a month long. Advent was also out. Certain feast days were forbidden too, and Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays were discouraged in many regions. That left maybe Tuesday. Maybe. So if you were a young couple ready to tie the knot, you'd better pull out a calendar, if your village even had one, and start crossing out all the dates the priest would say no to. And of course, just because a date was available didn't mean it was practical. The harvest season was too busy. So was planting season, and during winter, no one wanted to walk across frozen fields in their best tunic. Rainy months made everything muddy. Dry months brought dust. There were no ideal options, just workable ones. Many villages were settled in late spring and early summer. The weather was decent, food was more plentiful, and there was a small window between holy restrictions where a priest might say, "Yes, I can marry you this week." May was popular in some places, especially around May Day. The fields were green, flowers were blooming, and people were generally in better spirits after surviving another winter. It felt like the right time for beginnings, but not everyone agreed. In some regions, May was avoided because old superstitions said marrying in May brought bad luck. One saying went, "Marry in May and you'll rue the day." No one knew why, but many couples decided not to test it. There were also beliefs about the phases of the moon. Some thought marrying during a waning moon was unlucky, when the light was shrinking. A waxing moon, on the other hand, symbolized growth and prosperity. Full moons were considered powerful, sometimes too powerful. New moons were quiet and cautious. Did everyone follow this? Not always. But if your grandmother said, "Wait until the moon is fat," you probably listened, just in case. Beyond all the rules and beliefs, people still tried to make their weddings feel special. Some villages avoided days associated with tragedy, like the day a fire burned the old mill or the harvest failed. Sometimes couples pick a date based on the availability of food. Uncle Gerard's pig will be ready next week was a good enough reason to schedule a wedding. After all, no one wanted to throw a feast with nothing but turnips and hope. Interestingly, astrology occasionally crept into wedding planning, especially among the wealthy. Nobles might consult an astrologer or priest who dabbled in star charts. He'd look at birth dates, planetary positions, and tell you which day would bring the best fortune. Of course, he'd also need a few coins for his trouble, and if the stars didn't align with your plans, he might be persuaded to interpret them. Creatively, once a date was chosen, the news spread quickly. A village didn't need printed invitations. Word of mouth was enough. "They're getting married next Sunday, after the noon bells," someone would say at the well. And by the next day, even the baker's cat seemed to know. Neighbors marked the day by preparing food, borrowing extra stools, and fixing up whatever passable clothing they had. Weddings were community events. People planned around them, not just to attend, but to help. On the morning of the wedding, the couple often fasted before the ceremony. It was a tradition tied to purification. No meat, no heavy food, just a simple breakfast, or nothing at all. It wasn't always pleasant, but it made the feast feel even more satisfying afterward. Superstitions also shaped the morning routine. Some believed it was bad luck for the bride and groom to see each other before the ceremony. Others thought that the bride should trip slightly as she stepped outside her house. It meant she'd rule the household. And if it rained, that depended. In some villages, it was a blessing. In others, it was a warning that the marriage would be full of tears. Either way, someone would always say, "Well, at least the crops will like it." Despite all the planning, rules, and rituals, the truth was this: weddings happened when they could, not when conditions were perfect, not when the weather was kind, but when families agreed, the priest was free, and the food was enough. Because in a life full of uncertainty, bad harvests, sudden illness, long winters, sometimes the bravest thing two people could do was stand before their neighbors, say yes, and hope for the best. Forget lace, pearls, and designer labels. In the Middle Ages, a bride's wedding outfit wasn't about trends. It was about practicality, modesty, and whatever she could pull from the chest under the bed without holes in it. The idea of a white wedding dress didn't exist yet. White was expensive to maintain and challenging to produce. And besides, in a world where laundry meant scrubbing over a barrel, nobody in their right mind wore white on purpose, especially not to a gathering with stew, firewood, and loose chickens. So what did medieval brides wear? Their best dress. It's not new, custom-made, and just the nicest thing they already own. Maybe it was the deep red wool tunic they only wore to church on feast days. Perhaps it was a blue linen gown their mother had handed down. Maybe it was patched in places, but if it was clean and presentable, it was wedding ready. Some brides might borrow something slightly fancier from a cousin or neighbor. Others might stitch a few extra details onto the sleeves. A bit of embroidery, a colored thread. Small touches made a difference. Colors varied by region and social class. Blue was standard, symbolizing purity and loyalty long before white took over. Green was sometimes worn, especially by younger brides. Red was bold and festive. Earthy browns and greys were more common among peasants, not for symbolism, but because they were practical and hid stains well. A bride from a wealthier household might wear brighter colors or trim her dress with decorative braid or fur. Gold thread, if you had it, was a statement. But for most people, just wearing something without a tear was enough. Headwear played an important role. A maiden typically wore her hair loose on her wedding day, one of the few times it was allowed in public without being braided or covered. Long, unbound hair was a sign of youth and unmarried status. Many brides wore a simple flower crown made from whatever was in season. daisies, rosemary, or small wild blooms. Sometimes the flowers were tied into a band with bits of ribbon or thread. It wasn't elaborate, but it felt special. In colder months, the bride might wear a hood or veil. Veils weren't always about modesty, they were also about warmth. A thin linen veil tied beneath the chin could keep the wind off your ears during a chilly church ceremony. Shoes were optional. If a bride had shoes, she wore them. If she didn't, she went barefoot. Some girls only owned one pair and saved them for the walk to church. Others borrowed or wore hand-me-downs that pinched the toes but got the job done. In noble weddings, footwear could be more decorative, leather with pointed toes, sometimes dyed or decorated. But you were fine for villagers as long as you didn't step in anything unfortunate on the way to the altar. Jewelry was rare but cherished. A simple necklace, a brooch, or a belt buckle might be passed down through generations and worn with care. If a family owned a silver pin, it might be brought out for the occasion, pinned at the bride's shoulder like a badge of honor. For many girls, this was the only time they'd wear anything close to ornamental. Grooms dressed similarly. What's the cleanest thing I have? A tunic without patches, a belt that wasn't fraying, and maybe a cloak if the weather called for it. His hair might be combed. He might have shaved. These small efforts said, "I'm ready." There were no tuxedos or formal suits, just good, solid clothing, and the occasional attempt to tuck in a shirt that didn't quite want to stay tucked. There was no pressure to match outfits. Couples didn't plan themes or color palettes. They didn't pose for portraits or coordinate accessories. But they did try to look decent, especially with neighbors watching and a priest standing nearby. What mattered most was effort. People noticed if your clothes were clean, your boots were tied, and your hair was brushed. Not because they expected perfection, but because getting married was a big moment, and dressing your best was a sign of respect for the occasion. After the ceremony, the bride might change into something simpler, especially if there was dancing, cooking, or helping with the feast. Fancy sleeves and long hems had a habit of getting in the way near open flames. In some villages, the bride would be gifted an apron or headscarf as part of the transition into married life, practical items for her new role in the household. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. And so, while medieval weddings lacked silk veils and custom gowns, they didn't lack care. People wore what they had, made the most of it, and took pride in presenting themselves with dignity and warmth. Because in the end, it wasn't about what you wore down the aisle. It was about who was standing beside you and what kind of life you planned to build together, patches, bare feet and all. In modern times, a marriage between a 13-year-old girl and a 40-year-old man would raise eyebrows and alarm bells. But in medieval Europe, it might not even raise a whisper. Age gaps in marriage weren't unusual. They were often expected, especially when land, inheritance, or alliances were involved. Among peasants, marriage tended to happen earlier for girls, usually in their mid-teens. A girl might already be married or at least betrothed by 14 or 15. For boys, it was often a little later. Not because they were waiting for love, but because they needed to be physically strong enough to run a household and work the fields. The church technically advised waiting until a girl was at least 12 and a boy 14 before marriage. But these were legal minimums, not recommendations. While many couples married young, actual cohabitation and children sometimes came later, after the couple had grown a bit or the family had enough resources to support them. But when it came to nobility, the rules bent even more. It wasn't uncommon for a nobleman in his 30s or 40s to marry a much younger girl, sometimes barely in her teens. These marriages had little to do with companionship. They were about securing titles, joining land, or producing an heir. A powerful man might remarry multiple times, especially if his previous wife died young or failed to bear children. These unions weren't considered scandalous. They were strategic. A noble father might be thrilled to marry off his daughter to a much older lord if it meant gaining favor, land, or peace. The girl's opinion often wasn't asked. She was expected to obey and adapt. And while these marriages may sound unsettling now, they weren't necessarily abusive in the context of the time. Often the older husband waited until the girl reached a more mature age before fully living as a man and wife. Sometimes she stayed with her family for another year or two before joining his household. But of course, that wasn't always the case. Expectations varied by region, by wealth, and by personality. Some young brides were treated kindly, others were expected to become adults overnight. Among peasants, marriages with significant age gaps were less about strategy and more about practicality. A widowed man with children might need help running his home. A young woman without prospects might accept the match in exchange for stability. These marriages were often more about survival than sentiment. A middle-aged farmer with 2 goats and a small plot of land might offer a safer, more secure future than a penniless boy with a nice smile. And in a world where comfort was rare, safety mattered. In small communities, everyone knew each other's history. People noticed if a young bride married a man twice her age, but they didn't necessarily judge. They might shrug and say, "Well, at least he has a roof and doesn't hit his pigs." It wasn't romantic, but it was real. And the reverse happened too. Sometimes an older widow married a younger man, especially if she had land and he had energy. That raised more eyebrows, but not because of age. More because people liked to gossip, and a woman in charge constantly stirred curiosity. There were also practical reasons for remarriage, especially after illness or war. Life was unpredictable. A woman might marry at 15, be widowed by 20, and remarry by 21. Men remarried quickly, especially if there were children to raise or farms to maintain. Second and third marriages were common. They weren't seen as tragic, they were necessary. Marriage wasn't a one-time romantic event. It was a cycle of building, losing, and rebuilding again. Children from previous marriages were part of the package. A new bride might walk into a household with stepchildren only a few years younger than herself. A groom might inherit a toddler along with his new wife. Blended families weren't unusual. They just worked things out as best they could. Everyone had to grow up fast. Childhood was short. Responsibility came early. And so a young bride stepping into a mature role wasn't seen as surprising. It was expected. Of course, not all age-gap marriages were successful. Some older husbands were controlling. Some young wives felt overwhelmed. But without modern romantic ideas, most couples focused on getting through each day, planting crops and feeding animals, raising children and surviving the winter. Affection, if it came later. A shared laugh during milking. A blanket was offered without asking. A quiet moment after the children had gone to bed. Small things, not poetic, but comforting. And so, when you hear that a medieval bride was 13 and her husband was 40, it's tempting to react with shock. But in their world, it wasn't a scandal. It was a decision shaped by custom, need, and the rhythms of survival. They didn't expect love to begin the marriage. They hoped it might appear along the way. In the Middle Ages, there was no photographer to capture your vows, no signature book with gold pens, and no video call for relatives who couldn't attend. But there was one thing every wedding needed: witnesses. Marriage wasn't just a private agreement, it was a public contract. To be considered valid in the eyes of the church and the community, someone had to hear the vows, see the nods, and remember what was said. Without witnesses, the whole thing could be questioned later, and no one wanted that. So who got the job? Usually whoever happened to be nearby: parents, siblings, the village baker, the woman who sold onions in the market. If they were standing there when the couple said "I do," they counted. 2 or 3 witnesses were the usual standard, but the more, the better. A wedding with 10 people watching was safer than just the bride's cousin and the dog. And once you were a witness, your role didn't stop after the ceremony. If anyone in the future claimed the marriage wasn't real, say if someone tried to marry a second person later, you were expected to step in and say, "No, I saw them wed. I heard it myself." Your memory became part of the record. Older villagers were especially valued as witnesses. They'd seen dozens of weddings. Some even remembered when someone tried to marry twice, and the scandal that followed. Having an elder say, "Yes, I was there," carried weight. So if your great-uncle Alain stood near the altar holding a walking stick and scowling at everyone, it wasn't because he disliked weddings. It was because he took his role very seriously. And later, over stew, he'd remind you that he'd also witnessed your parents' wedding, your aunt's, and the one where the groom fainted halfway through. In noble weddings, the witness list was more formal. Guests were seated according to rank. Essential figures were chosen to sign a written agreement, especially if land or titles were involved. The priest would note their names. The records were sometimes kept at the church or manor. These documents could be helpful years later, especially if heirs began arguing about inheritance. Among commoners, records were more casual. If he had one, a priest might write the names in the parish book. But most of the time, people just remembered. And in small communities, memories were surprisingly reliable. Everyone knew who got married, when, and what the bride wore or didn't wear. There were customs too. In some regions, the groom's best friend or brother stood beside him during the vows, not to hold a ring, but to make sure he didn't faint or forget his lines. The bride might be accompanied by her mother, aunt, or a neighbor who had raised 7 children and knew how these things went. Sometimes these helpers were called sponsors or godparents of the marriage. Their job was to support the couple before and after the wedding. If the couple disagreed later, these sponsors might say, "Now remember your vows." It wasn't legal mediation, it was village wisdom. Witnesses were also there to ensure the marriage was consensual. Consent was a big deal, at least officially. Both bride and groom had to speak clearly and agree of their own will. If someone mumbled, hesitated, or looked terrified, a good witness might pull them aside and ask, "Are you sure?" This didn't always prevent pressure or manipulation, but added a layer of accountability. If trouble came later, the witness could say, "She said yes, loud and clear." Or in rare cases, "She didn't say anything and I thought it was strange." After the ceremony, the role of the witnesses changed. Now they were guests. They joined the feast, clinked mugs, and told stories. Some had known the couple since they were children. Others had helped them through hard times. Their presence made the wedding feel rooted in something real, not just a ritual, but a shared moment for the whole village. Even years later, those same people might say, "I was there the day they got married. It was raining, and the bride's shoe broke, and the priest forgot his Bible, but it still counts." That memory became part of the marriage, a little thread in the fabric of the community. In some places, witnesses even participated in symbolic rituals. They might escort the bride to the groom's home. They might walk ahead with torches at night. One old tradition involved throwing grain or dried herbs as a blessing for fertility. If you were close to the couple, you were part of the ritual, whether you wanted to be or not. Some witnesses helped the couple prepare their new home, stacking firewood, sweeping the threshold, or placing bread and salt by the door. These simple acts weren't fancy, but they carried meaning. And so, while there were no tuxedos or speech rehearsals, the role of the witness in a medieval wedding was clear. You were there to hear, to remember, and to help. You didn't need to be perfect, you just needed to care. And if you were lucky, you got a good bowl of stew too. After the vows were said and the stew was finally warm, the medieval wedding became something most people looked forward to for weeks. The celebration. This wasn't just a meal, it was a proper party, complete with music, dancing, jokes, and a few unpredictable moments that no one ever planned for. And like most good parties, it didn't need much to start. A bit of ale, a cleared patch of dirt, and enough people willing to stomp their feet were usually all it took. Dancing came first. There weren't choreographed waltzes or polished routines, just simple group dances, clapping, turning, and the occasional trip over someone's foot. People didn't mind. Everyone joined in. Young and old, drunk or sober, barefoot or in patched boots. Someone might bring a drum or a flute, but there was always rhythm, even if no instruments were around. A pot lid and a spoon could keep the beat. A chorus of humming could carry the tune. And the best dancers weren't always the most graceful. They were the ones smiling the widest. The bride's flower crown might fall off if the dancing got wild. The groom might rip a seam in his tunic. Someone might spin too quickly and land in a haystack. But again, no one minded. Laughter was part of the ritual. Between dances, there were games. One popular favorite, the shoe race. Guests would remove one shoe, pile them in the center, then run to grab their own back at the sound of a shout. It was chaos. People tripped, grabbed the wrong shoe, or ran off laughing with two left feet. No one cared who won. In some villages, guests would toss small rolls or pieces of bread toward the bride and groom, not as an insult, but as a way of saying good luck and here's something to nibble on later. The trick was avoiding getting hit in the face by a slightly stale crust. There were also word games, riddles, and mock challenges. Someone might dare the groom to lift a barrel or challenge the bride to name 5 saints without pausing. If she could, the room cheered. If not, someone poured her a cup of ale and said, "Try again next year." For fun, guests sometimes performed little skits or impersonations. The groom's younger brother might imitate the priest. The bride's cousin might sing a slightly off-key song about married life. There was always a neighbor who thought he could juggle apples until one landed in the soup. Even mild teasing was allowed as long as it didn't cross the line. "Don't burn the stew like your mother," someone might shout to the groom, and everyone laughed. It was familiar, light-hearted, and, most importantly, harmless. There were also quiet moments. Someone might tell the story of how the bride and groom met, or a memory from childhood. Sometimes a village elder offered advice, not the flowery kind, but the honest kind. Keep the firewood dry. Take turns watching the goats. Don't go to bed angry. Unless the bed is too small, then sleep in the barn. It wasn't poetic, but it was real. And often it was precisely what the couple needed to hear. Food played its role in the festivities. People brought what they had: pies filled with turnips, small wheels of cheese, roasted onions with herbs, and, if luck was on their side, meat, usually rabbit, chicken, or salted pork. There was always bread, sometimes hard as stone, occasionally warm and soft, depending on who baked it. And there was ale, homemade, strong, and poured generously. No one judged the quality. It was the quantity that mattered. Sharing was part of the ritual. A guest might break their loaf in half and pass it to a stranger. Someone might offer their last apple to a child. These gestures were quiet but meaningful. Children had their fun. They chased each other around the tables, tried to sneak extra berries, or tied bits of cloth to the dog's tail. If they got tired, someone's lap became a pillow. If they cried, someone always had a bit of bread to distract them. Animals wandered in and out too. A cat might curl up near the fire. A curious goat might nibble at the corner of the tablecloth. It was all part of the experience. And finally, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned from blue to gold, the dancing slowed. People began to gather their things. The older guests found a bench or a stool and leaned back, smiling. The bride and groom, tired but glowing, sat side by side, watching it all. There were no fireworks, no speeches with microphones, just full stomachs, warm hearts, and the knowledge that something had begun. Everyone had witnessed it. When it came time for the vows, medieval couples didn't read from printed cards or recite lines rehearsed in front of a mirror. They didn't say, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health, in poetic rhythm. Instead, the words were plain, practical, and spoken in a way everyone could understand, even those standing near the stew pot. Because at its core, a medieval marriage vow wasn't about sounding impressive. It was about being clear. In a typical village wedding, the couple might face each other and say something along the lines of, "I take you as my wedded wife," or "I take you as my husband, to be true and faithful, as long as we both shall live." It didn't take long. But everyone nearby listened closely, because those few sentences meant something permanent. Once those words were said, with at least 2 people hearing them, the marriage was valid in the eyes of the church and the village. And in a world without paperwork, clear speaking mattered. The church encouraged formal wording. Priests might add Latin phrases like "ego te accipio in uxorem," "I take you as my wife," or remind the couple that this was a holy sacrament. But in many villages, especially where the priest only showed up once a season, people did their best with the words they knew. The critical thing was mutual consent. If both parties said yes, if both wanted to be married, and if someone could testify to hearing them say it, that was enough. No signatures, no rings required. Just an agreement, spoken clearly, witnessed honestly. Still, there were variations. In some regions, the couple would join hands during the vow. Not a gentle hand-holding gesture, but a firm clasp, like sealing a deal. It was sometimes called a hand fasting, where the priest or elder might tie a ribbon or cloth around their joined hands to symbolize unity. This wasn't just for show, it was a visual cue that the two were now joined, and everyone around them could see it. After the vow, the priest, if present, would bless the union. He might pray for healthy children, a long life, or peace in the household. And occasionally, he'd remind the couple that marriage was about patience, humility, and knowing when to stop talking during arguments. He might also gently mention the church's expectations, faithfulness, modesty, and observing certain holy days when intimacy was not permitted. These instructions varied depending on the priest's mood and how long people were willing to stand. The vows, once said, weren't just for the ceremony, they were remembered. Neighbors might refer to them later. You promised to be faithful. You swore to be honest. You said, as long as we both shall live, remember? In a time when few people could write, memory was the record. And in a village where everyone knew everyone, those memories stuck. That said, not all vows were remembered the same way. Some couples had a sense of humor. They teased each other at the altar. One might whisper a joke, the other might forget a line. People laughed, but they also listened. Because behind the lightness was a very real promise. Others were nervous. A bride might speak softly, eyes down. A groom might clear his throat twice before saying anything. No one judged, everyone understood. It was a big moment, no matter how many times you'd practiced in your head. And though there was no legal requirement for a kiss, some couples sealed the vow with one. Others nodded, or hugged, or smiled and turned toward the feast without much fuss. Physical displays weren't expected, but if they happened, people smiled approvingly. What mattered most wasn't the form, it was the sincerity. In noble weddings, vows were sometimes longer, especially if land or dowries were involved. The bride and groom might recite lines prepared by the family. They might sign a contract before or after. But even then, the spoken agreement remained essential. The church insisted on hearing both people say yes with their voices. And if one person hesitated or said nothing, that could cause the entire ceremony to stop. A silent bride wasn't assumed to agree. She had to speak. Her yes was required. At least in theory. Of course, there were cases where pressure played a role. Families pushed, expectations loomed. But still, the moment of the vow remained powerful. Because once said, it wasn't easy to undo. Divorce was nearly impossible. Annulments were rare. So saying those words wasn't just tradition, it was commitment in the truest sense. Now, as you settle into the quiet rhythm of the evening, imagine two people standing before their neighbors. No spotlight, no music. Just steady breath and careful words. I take you. Not shouted, not whispered. Just spoken for all to hear. A promise made without paperwork or fanfare, but one meant to last. After the vows had been spoken and the blessings delivered, the wedding celebration turned toward what everyone had secretly been waiting for. The food. Medieval wedding feasts didn't come with printed menus or assigned seating. No one asked about allergies or special diets. But if the couple was lucky and the village had time to prepare, there'd be a long table or just a patch of cleared ground, covered with every bit of food people could gather, share, or carry in a basket. And whether it was modest or abundant, it was always appreciated. Peasant wedding feasts were built around sharing. Everyone brought something, not because it was required, but because it was expected in the way that all village things were, unspoken, understood, and cooperative. One neighbor brought bread, another cheese. Someone turned up with boiled cabbage wrapped in cloth, still warm. A family that raised chickens might contribute eggs. If someone had a pig ready for roasting, it became the meal's centerpiece and the cause of much admiration. There weren't many rules about what you could bring. The only rule was simple. Get what you can and bring it with a whole heart. Most of the dishes were made from ingredients that could be found locally and cheaply. Barley stew, turnip soup, flatbread, and roasted root vegetables were typical. If there was fruit, it had probably been dried and saved from the summer. If there were sweets, they were made with honey or dried figs, not sugar. too rare and too expensive for most villagers. One family might bring a simple onion pie. Another might bake a large flat loaf spiced with herbs. Everyone hoped someone would bring ale, and usually someone did. Drinks came in wooden mugs, clay cups, or whatever was clean and available. Ale was the standard, mild, homemade, and served at room temperature. It wasn't about getting drunk, it was about sharing warmth. One mug might pass through 5 hands before returning to its owner, and no one minded. For those who didn't drink, there was water from the well or weak herbal infusions, usually mint or chamomile. Children drank what they were given and made do with bites of bread when the stew was too hot. The feast didn't follow a strict schedule. Food arrived when it was ready. People ate when they were hungry. You didn't sit and wait politely for a course to be announced. You grabbed what was nearby, offered half to the person beside you, and kept talking. Plates were rare. Most people used wooden bowls or ate from shared platters. Bread was often used as a plate too, sturdy enough to hold stew and tasty enough to eat afterward. The focus wasn't on presentation, it was on togetherness. Seating was flexible. Suppose you found a bench, great. If not, a tree stump or a patch of grass would do. Children sat on laps, elders leaned on walking sticks. Someone always gave up their spot for the grandmother who'd baked the best rye loaf. And there was no hierarchy. The bride might sit beside her cousin. The groom might share a log with the blacksmith. For that one afternoon, status melted away. Everyone was just family. Of course, in noble weddings, the meal was something else entirely. Noble wedding feasts were showcased in great halls with long wooden tables and high ceilings. The more food, the better. Whole roasted animals, elaborate pies, and sweet pastries shaped like animals or flowers filled the tables. Servants moved constantly, keeping the courses coming. Guests sat in rank. Nobles at the high table, others arranged according to title. The bride and groom were center stage, expected to smile, sip politely, and take dainty bites while the rest of the room watched. Musicians played, jesters told jokes, dancers performed between courses. It was a performance almost as much as a meal. But even in these grand halls, people still looked forward to the roast duck or the honey cakes. Back in the village, things were simpler but no less joyful. When the food began to run out, someone brought out a pot of thick porridge or a second loaf wrapped in cloth. When the last mug seemed dry, someone produced a small jug from behind a tree. It wasn't magic, it was just people looking out for one another. And when everyone was packed, complete, not just polite full, they sat back, loosened their belts, and listened to the wind. The kind of silence that settles in after a good meal, when the only sounds are a creaking bench and someone humming softly by the fire. There were no toasts, no speeches. But someone might raise a mug and say, "May they never go hungry." Another might add, "May their roof hold in the rain." Simple blessings, spoken without ceremony, but remembered long after. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the bride and groom looked around. Tired, maybe a little overwhelmed, but also grateful. This was the part of the wedding that stayed with them, not the vows, not the flower crown, but the sight of everyone gathered, eating, laughing, and offering what they could. A feast not made of silver and gold, but of kindness. As your breath slows and your body rests, picture a long wooden table beneath an open sky. Loaves of bread, bowls of stew, and clay mugs passed from hand to hand. The crackle of fire, the hum of quiet conversation, the kind of fullness that isn't just in the belly, but in the heart. And sitting side by side, the couple who started it all. Not dressed like royalty, not posing for portraits, just sharing a simple plate of food and a moment of peace. After the vows were spoken, the bread was shared and the stew pot scraped clean. There came a moment at every medieval wedding when people leaned back, loosened their belts, and someone picked up an instrument. And just like that, the music began. It didn't matter if the violin was a little out of tune or the tambourine was missing half its bells. People danced, not because they were trained, but because the joy bubbled up and they had nowhere else to go. Medieval dancing was graceful and formal. And at noble courts, it sometimes was. Slow, elegant steps in patterns you had to memorize or mess up in front of a dozen watchful eyes. But in villages, not quite. In the countryside, dancing was enthusiastic. People clapped, stomped, spun in circles until they got dizzy and grabbed the nearest stable object. Hopefully a person, not a barrel. Children wove between adults, half dancing, half tripping. Someone shouted the rhythm, someone else ignored it, and no one minded. There weren't professional bands usually, just whoever could play. A fiddler, a flutist, a boy with a drum made from a stretched goat hide. Sometimes even spoons and clapping hands filled the rhythm. What mattered wasn't perfection, it was participation. The songs were familiar, simple tunes passed down through generations. Lyrics about love, rain, goats, and one particularly confusing verse about a duck in a wheelbarrow. People sang along even if they didn't know the words. Humming counted. The bride and groom were expected to dance first, not a polished waltz, just a symbolic few steps, hand in hand, sometimes laughing nervously, sometimes shy, often tired. But they danced, the crowd cheered, and then everyone joined in. There was no pressure to look good, only to look like you were trying. Older villagers didn't always dance, but they clapped along. One might tap their walking stick in time with the beat. Another might hum a harmony too old to trace. And occasionally, when no one was looking, someone's grandfather got pulled into the circle and surprised everyone with fancy footwork. "That's what he did to win me over," his wife might say, grinning into her mug of ale. At noble weddings, the music came from hired minstrels, lutes, harps, soft drums, and even a pipe organ if you were especially fancy. The dances were more structured, with rules, turns, and bows. But even nobles loosened up after a few cups of wine. You could spot the moment when a stiff-lipped baron laughed, or a young lady kicked off her shoes and spun too fast and collapsed into a chair, breathless and grinning. Even silk shoes can stomp. Some weddings had games, a race around the field, a tug of war, a contest to see who could lift a barrel the highest or sing the longest without forgetting the words. The prize was usually bread or a jug of ale, but the real reward was laughter. Children chased each other through haystacks. Teenagers whispered behind fences. Elders watched it all unfold, smiling at memories stirred by rhythm and motion. Sometimes people stayed until the stars came out. Lanterns flickered, the fire burned low, and the music softened into something gentler. Songs that told stories of old loves, lost places, hopes for the future. Couples swayed slowly, not quite dancing, just moving, together. No one checked the time. There were no clocks to worry about. The wedding lasted until people were too tired to laugh, too full to eat more, and too content to speak. Then, one by one, they drifted home, some humming. Some are holding hands. Some are already planning to use the leftover bread for breakfast. And when the village square was quiet again and only embers glowed, you could still feel the music in the ground, in the stomped grass, in the footprints left by bare feet and muddy boots. A wedding wasn't just a ceremony, it was a celebration of staying human, singing even when your voice cracked, dancing even if your knees hurt, and laughing until the stars blurred overhead. Nobody expected wrapping paper, gift bags, or a neat little card with cursive handwriting in a medieval wedding. But that didn't mean there weren't presents. Guests still brought wedding gifts, practical, thoughtful, and occasionally odd. Because in a world where survival was a daily task, the best wedding gift was something you could use before nightfall. For most villagers, giving a gift wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about helping the couple start their new life with something useful. A wooden ladle, a bundle of dried herbs, a strong broom made from river reeds. These were real treasures to people who lived with little. One neighbor might arrive with a clay pot she'd made herself. Another might offer a bundle of firewood tied with a string. A cousin might carry over a sack of onions or a piece of salted pork wrapped in cloth. No one laughed at a humble gift. In fact, the simpler it was, the more sincere it felt. Cheese was surprisingly common. Not the kind you'd find in a shop today, but fresh rounds made from goat or cow's milk. wrapped in linen, tied with twine, and sometimes flavored with garlic or herbs. It didn't last long, but made for a good breakfast the next morning. Other edible gifts included small sacks of barley, a loaf of crusty bread, or a bottle of home-brewed cider. Anything that helped stock the pantry was welcomed with open arms, especially if the couple doesn't yet have their cow or garden. Some guests gifted handmade items, a wool blanket stitched with the initials of the bride and groom, a carved spoon or drinking cup, a woven basket, perfect for gathering herbs or carrying laundry, a bar of coarse homemade soap wrapped in dry leaves. These items were often made with the giver's hands and carried a quiet meaning. A well-worn tool passed down from a grandparent wasn't flashy, but it said, "I want you to succeed." Of course, there were more humorous gifts too. A brother might present the groom with a broken horseshoe, saying, "For luck, because you'll need it." An aunt might give a second-hand chicken and say, "She lays 1 egg a week," or "She used to, you'll find out." These gifts got laughs but were still appreciated because even a chicken with attitude was better than no chicken at all. Among noble families, gift-giving looked a bit different. There were still valuable items, fine linens, silver cups, bolts of fabric, but they came in decorated boxes and were carried by servants. Jewelry was common, scented oils, books of prayer bound in leather. Sometimes land or livestock was formally transferred as part of the dowry or wedding contract. Guests with titles often brought elaborate gifts that matched their status. A pair of doves in a gilded cage, a chest of spices from distant ports, a set of imported combs made from ivory or polished horn. These presents were more about display than practicality. They impressed, they sparkled, and they made excellent conversation topics during the meal. But even in noble circles, small gifts from trusted friends were often the most meaningful. A handwritten blessing, a family heirloom, a simple bracelet worn by the bride's mother on her wedding day. Ultimately, no matter the social class, weddings are about connection. And gifts, whether big or small, funny or serious, were a way of saying, "We care." Interestingly, some gifts were symbolic. In a few regions, giving the couple a loaf of bread, a jug of ale, and a bit of salt was customary. Bread so they would never go hungry. Ale for joy, salt for preservation, and perhaps patience. A farming neighbor might gift a small sack of seeds. For your garden, may it grow as your family does. A blacksmith might offer a horseshoe, this time not broken, blessing the household with strength and movement. These gestures reminded the couple that they weren't starting from zero. They had support, they had help, they were not alone. Gifts didn't always come on the wedding day. Some were delivered days before, when people came to help with preparations. Others arrived a day or two after, once things had calmed down. And a few came from relatives who couldn't attend, carried by travelers or neighbors. There was no registry, no return policy, no pressure, just people offering what they had, when they could, in the way they knew best. And sometimes the most valuable gift of all was time. A neighbor who helped repair the roof, and a cousin who stayed to clean up after the feast. A friend brought over firewood before the first cold night. These acts weren't wrapped in ribbon, but they were remembered. They said more than words ever could. For modern couples, the wedding night is usually a private matter. In medieval times, not always. While the details varied from place to place, the first night of marriage wasn't always spent alone and in silence. Privacy in the medieval world was hard to come by. Many families lived in one-room cottages, shared with parents, siblings, children, and the occasional goat. So expecting a quiet, romantic evening for the newlyweds was often unrealistic. But the first night still carried meaning. People paid attention, because in the eyes of both church and community, it wasn't just the vows that made a marriage official, it was the consummation. In some regions, the newlyweds were gently escorted to their bed after the feast, sometimes by family or a group of cheering friends. They might be walked through the village, still in their wedding clothes, carrying torches or candles, as a small procession formed behind them. It sounds festive, and it was, but also slightly awkward. especially if your grandmother was among the group singing old love songs. Once at the couple's home, a few guests might enter the room with them. They didn't stay long, but they helped prepare the bed, said blessings, and sometimes shared a drink with the couple before quietly stepping out. In noble families, the process could be even more formal. There are records of noble couples accompanied to the bedchamber by witnesses, relatives, attendants, or priests. In some rare cases, a clergy member remained nearby to confirm that the marriage was, as they put it, completed. Not that they stood and watched, but their presence outside the door or in the adjoining room served as a legal safeguard. For the couple, it was pressure. For the family, it was proof. The next morning, if the marriage had been physically consummated, there might even be a public announcement. Or, in some traditions, the bedsheets were shown as evidence. This wasn't always required, but it was practiced in some places, especially among the upper classes. Among common folk, things were a little more relaxed. People still cared whether the couple had shared a bed, but they didn't need physical proof. A nod from the bride's mother, a knowing smile from the groom. That was usually enough. Of course, not all couples were eager to rush into things. Some were exhausted, some were nervous, and some had barely spoken before the wedding. It wasn't unusual for a new husband to sleep on the floor the first night, or for a bride to insist on waiting a few days. And while church doctrine expected intimacy, most villages knew better than to pry too deeply. Life was hard enough without people counting how many nights you stayed up talking versus sleeping. Still, jokes were common. Neighbors might tease the groom the morning after about how tired he looked. Someone might ask if the bride remembered to cook breakfast. A well-meaning uncle might wink too, obviously. But for all the humor, there was also understanding. This was a new chapter, a shift in roles. Two people are adjusting not just to each other, but to share a space, a blanket, and a future. For some couples, the first night was the first time they'd truly been alone. No parents, no siblings. Just quiet, finally. Maybe they sat beside the fire, shared leftover bread, or talked about the funny things people said at the feast. Perhaps they didn't speak at all. What mattered wasn't how romantic the night was. What mattered was that they had crossed a threshold. They had made a promise, shared a meal, and now shared a space. That was the beginning of something real. Of course, things weren't always easy. Some brides were very young. Some grooms were awkward or impatient. Not every first night was kind, but many couples settled into routine over time, found understanding, and slowly built something together. Intimacy wasn't always instant. It took time, trust, patience, and in a world with thin walls and no locks, a good sense of humor helped too. Interestingly, the community gave the couple a day or two off from heavy chores in some regions. It wasn't an official holiday, but neighbors pitched in to let the couple rest, recover, and get used to their new rhythm. A small gift of time in a life rarely slowed down. After that, things returned to normal quickly. The animals still needed feeding. The fields still needed hoeing. But now, everything was shared. And so, the wedding night wasn't always private. It wasn't always romantic. But it marked the beginning of something important. Life lived side by side, a warm fire, a narrow bed, 2 pairs of shoes at the door. No one expected magic, they just hoped for peace. In modern times, newlyweds might head off to a quiet cabin or a beachside resort for a week of rest and celebration. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as a honeymoon, unless you counted 3 hours of sleep before the rooster crowed. The day after a wedding wasn't a vacation. It was usually back to work. If it were spring, the fields had to be plowed. If it were autumn, the grain needed to be stored. If it were winter, firewood had to be chopped. The wedding might have been beautiful, but it didn't stop time, or chores. Still, there was a quiet shift. Now the couple was seen as a household. Even if they still lived with family, they were a unit. People referred to them as the newlyweds. Neighbors might drop by with leftover food. A friend might offer help fixing a leaking roof or digging a vegetable patch. These gestures weren't grand, but they made a difference. Some villages had small traditions for the morning after. A friend might sweep ashes from the couple's hearth to clear the old and welcome the new. A midwife or elder woman might visit the bride to offer quiet advice about marriage and homekeeping, not with lectures, but simple reminders like keep the stew from burning and never let the goats sleep inside. The first few days of married life were a time of settling in, rearranging belongings, hanging a pouch of herbs by the doorway and learning each other's sleeping habits. Whose feet were colder? Who kicked the blanket? Who snored like a tired ox? It was the start of a shared routine, not always exciting, but comforting. There was no dramatic division of labor in most peasant households. Everyone did what was needed. The husband might fix a fence in the morning and fetch water in the evening. The wife might knead dough at dawn and tend goats at dusk. Flexibility was survival. Still, there were understood rhythms. Women handled more of the cooking, cleaning, and care for children. Men did more of the heavy lifting, fieldwork, and public dealings. But if one was sick or away, the other stepped in. There wasn't enough time for strict roles. Money was scarce, so starting married life meant relying on what you had or what your families could provide. If you were lucky, you had your tools, a small plot of land, a borrowed donkey. If not, you worked on someone else's farm or learned a trade. Some newlyweds moved in with relatives, parents, siblings, or in-laws. Others squeezed into a one-room hut, often sharing it with animals. A corner for sleeping, a corner for storing dried herbs, a pot over the hearth, and if there was a door that closed properly, even better. Despite the tight quarters, the newness brought joy. Even if the mattress was thin and the roof leaked in 2 places, there was a sense of, this is ours. A small bowl was carved together, a cloth stitched with both their initials, a shared meal by firelight that tasted better simply because it was eaten side by side. And while there was no official honeymoon, there were pauses, moments carved out of the busy days to just be. A shared walk to the well, a quiet laugh while folding laundry, a glance across the field while planting barley. No candles, no champagne, but something soft and steady began to grow. Among nobles, things were a bit different. After a grand wedding, noble couples might indeed take time away, but it was rarely just for leisure. They might travel to a second manor, visit family lands, or appear in nearby towns to strengthen alliances. It was as much diplomacy as it was romance. Servants packed their things. Escorts ensured their safety. Even their time together was watched, scheduled, and occasionally interrupted by letters from home. But still within those constraints, young noble couples carved out space to learn each other through letters, long walks in castle courtyards, or late-night meals shared behind drawn curtains. Whether rich or poor, the early days of marriage were a quiet transition. 2 people suddenly expected to live, work, and grow old together. No tests, no instruction manuals, just patience, trial and error, and a willingness to laugh when the goat chewed the laundry. Again. Sometimes the adjustment was smooth. Other times, things settled after a few arguments over firewood or misplaced tools. But most couples found a rhythm because they had to, and because, slowly, they wanted to. Becoming a bride in medieval times wasn't just about changing your last name, though most women didn't do that. It was about stepping into a new role with new expectations, responsibilities, and often a new set of chores. From the moment a woman was married, people looked at her differently. One day, she was someone's daughter, weaving by the fire. Next, she was the wife, expected to manage a household, care for others, and keep the bread from burning even if the wind blew smoke back into the room. For peasant women, the role of wife was full-time, hands-on, and never-ending. She rose early, before the sun in most seasons, and tended to everything that needed attention. That might mean feeding the animals, fetching water, or getting a pot of barley or porridge bubbling before the rest of the household stirred. If she shared a home with in-laws, she had to learn the rhythms of someone else's kitchen, broom, and way of folding linens. And yes, those things mattered. There were rules, spoken or not, about how stew should be stirred, how cheese should be wrapped, and how to answer the door if the priest stopped by. It wasn't easy, but most young brides learned fast. They had to. Beyond the kitchen and animals, she spun wool, mended clothing, cleaned ash from the hearth, swept the floor, even if it was just packed earth, and kept a watchful eye on the pantry. Running out of salt or firewood wasn't just inconvenient, it could make life difficult. She also had to keep an eye on her husband's moods. If he came home tired and muddy, she had to balance giving him space with making sure he didn't forget to repair the broken latch on the door. Marriage wasn't glamorous, it was practical. It was exhausting, but it was also meaningful. And amid all that labor, there were small joys. Even after a long day, her husband left her a small slice of bread. The moment when the fire crackled right and the cottage felt warm, a visit from her sister or neighbor bringing news, or a pinch of dried mint. Sometimes she'd sit by the fire, untangle yarn, and feel, just for a second, that this small, quiet life was hers. She was not just someone's wife, but someone making a home. Her responsibilities proliferated if children came soon after the wedding, and they often did. Childbirth was risky, but it was also expected. A wife was judged gently or otherwise by how soon she produced a healthy baby. And yet, there was no real break. A new mother was still expected to cook, sweep, and carry water when she could. Sometimes neighbors helped, especially older women who'd seen a dozen births. But often, life moved on too fast for anyone to stop and rest. For women who married into a new village, things were more complicated. She had to learn not just a new household, but a new social world. Who was trustworthy, who to avoid, which paths were safest, which corners of the market held the best onions. But most villages welcomed her in time if she was kind, hard-working, and remembered not to gossip too loudly. And slowly, over weeks and months, she'd build something of her own. A shelf with her herbs, a wooden spoon she carved herself, a fire that burned the way she liked it. Among noblewomen, the duties were different, but no less demanding. A lady might not fetch water herself, but she managed servants who did. She kept accounts, oversaw the kitchen, ordered supplies, and maintained order in the household. She was expected to host guests, respectfully represent her family, and produce heirs, preferably sons. And in some cases, she had to manage her husband's estate while he was off at war or summoned to court. That meant supervising harvests, dealing with tenants, and even settling disputes. The higher the status, the more pressure. A mistake in a peasant's kitchen meant burned stew. An error in a noble household could mean scandal, or worse. But whether in a manor or a thatched hut, becoming a wife was about more than tasks. It was about partnership, about learning to live beside someone, adjust to their habits, quirks, and snoring. It was about moments of quiet cooperation, passing the bucket without speaking and repairing the fence together before the rain, laughing just once when the goat ate the laundry again. It wasn't always romantic, but it was real. And so, for a medieval bride, marriage wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of the busiest, most demanding, and often most meaningful chapter of her life. She didn't expect perfection, just a warm hearth, a whole pot, and maybe, on a good day, a husband who remembered to knock the mud off his boots before coming in. In the Middle Ages, being a newlywed husband wasn't just about carrying the bride across the threshold, especially since most thresholds were uneven stone slabs, and the doorway was already crowded with firewood. No, becoming a husband was about stepping up. Whether you were a peasant, a merchant, or a low-ranking knight, the moment you said, "I take you," you became responsible, not only for yourself, but for a household, a future, and in many ways, your partner's well-being. For most men, this meant no change to their early mornings. The rooster still crowed, the sheep still wandered. The chores didn't pause for romance, but now every task felt different. You weren't just mending a fence, but repairing your family's fence. You weren't just chopping wood, you were keeping your wife warm. That shift in mindset, though small, meant a lot. A husband was expected to provide, protect, and pull his weight, not by declarations, but by doing the work, and doing it daily. In peasant villages, the husband's role was practical above all else. He tilled the soil, harvested crops, bartered for tools, and ensured the roof didn't fall in during the season's first storm, but he was also expected to treat his wife fairly. Not just because it was nice, but because the church said so, and the community quietly enforced it. A man who was cruel to his wife gained a bad reputation. And reputations in medieval villages stuck like mud to boots. Of course, not all husbands were kind, but most understood that cooperation led to survival. A wife who trusted you worked harder beside you. A household built on respect could weather more than just wind and rain. He was also expected to represent his family in public matters. That meant attending local gatherings, speaking with village leaders, and defending household decisions if they were questioned. If someone disputed your property line or claimed your goat wandered into their yard, it was the husband's job to sort it out. Preferably without shouting, but shouting still happened. Money was tight for nearly everyone. A husband had to be creative. If he couldn't grow food, he might learn a trade: blacksmithing, coopering, or shoemaking. Some men traveled for seasonal work, leaving their wives to run the home in their absence. That required trust, and a sound communication system, usually delivered by neighbors, messengers, or just word of mouth. When he returned, he brought whatever he'd earned. A bag of oats, a knife, a handful of coins. Enough to make the winter easier, and maybe a small surprise: a comb, a ribbon, a smile. Among nobles, husbands had different duties: land management, political alliances, and military service. A nobleman might not chop his firewood, but he was still expected to lead, manage, and occasionally ride off into battle. Even with higher status, many noble husbands still cared about the harmony of their household. A poorly kept manor reflected poorly on its lord. An unhappy marriage could lead to whispered scandals, broken alliances, or, at the very least, awkward dinners. Like a wise peasant, a nobleman understood the value of listening to his wife, even if she wasn't in charge on paper. Emotionally, husbands weren't expected to be overly expressive. Love wasn't loud in medieval times. You didn't declare your affection over dinner. But it showed in gestures. A husband mended his wife's bucket handle without being asked. He remembered her favorite herbs. He stood up for her when someone made a crude joke at the feast. These things mattered, even if no one said so out loud. Of course, not all marriages were smooth. Disagreements happened about money, chores, visiting relatives, or whose turn it was to fix the chicken coop door. But most couples learned to navigate the bumps, some through patience, some through shared laughter, and some just went for long walks in opposite directions until they cooled off. There was no instruction manual, just the understanding that a husband had to keep showing up, to work, to listen, to build a life together, one stubborn roof tile at a time. Sometimes a new husband might sit by the fire on quiet evenings and realize how much had changed, not dramatically, but in small ways. There was another pair of shoes by the door now, a second spoon in the bowl. A familiar voice was humming while folding clothes, and though the days were long and the winters cold, there was comfort in knowing you were no longer alone. In the Middle Ages, getting married was relatively simple. Two people exchanged vows in front of witnesses, and that was that. But undoing a marriage, that was another story. And spoiler alert, it rarely happened. In the way we think of it today, divorce wasn't an option for most people. The church didn't allow it. Marriage was a sacred bond, a holy sacrament. Once the vows were spoken and the union consummated, the bond was considered unbreakable, at least in the eyes of God. So if a couple realized they weren't a good match, they didn't get a divorce. They got creative. The church did allow annulments, but only under particular circumstances. An annulment didn't mean a marriage had failed. It meant legally it had never really existed in the first place. To get an annulment, you had to prove one of the following. The marriage wasn't consensual. One party was already married to someone else. The couple was too closely related, hello cousins. One or both were too young at the time of marriage. The marriage was never consummated. That last one could be tricky to prove. And yes, sometimes people were asked to testify about it. For the average peasant, though, annulment was more fantasy than reality. The process required time, witnesses, influence, and usually a fair amount of money. That meant it was more accessible to nobles or the wealthy. not to the woman who lived near the edge of the village with 2 goats and a leaky roof. So what happens when things go wrong in a marriage? Often, people endured. If a couple didn't get along, they might live separately, but still be technically married. A husband might sleep in the barn. A wife might move back in with her parents. Neighbors would notice, of course, and gossip would spread. But legally, they were still bound. Sometimes informal separations were accepted by the community. The couple still had responsibilities to each other, financial, social, and occasionally parental, but they no longer shared a home. It wasn't ideal, but it happened. In more serious cases, abuse, abandonment, or extreme conflict, the church might grant a separation from bed and board. This wasn't a complete annulment. Some of the strangest stories came from the nobility. A noblewoman who married her servant after her husband died mysteriously during a hunting trip. A duke who swore an oath of chastity but changed his mind at 45 and married a girl half his age. A princess who refused all suitors until she was given a book of poetry and decided the scribe who wrote it would do just fine. These tales often ended in whispers, songs, or sometimes trouble. But they proved that the heart occasionally wandered off the approved path, even behind castle walls. There were also records, scattered, rare, of same-sex partnerships. Not marriages in the legal or church sense, but long-term companionships. 2 men who lived together for decades, farmed the same land, and were buried side by side. 2 women who raised a household of nieces and nephews and were known simply as the aunties. The church didn't recognize such unions, and society rarely spoke of them. But they existed in quiet corners, behind closed doors, and in the soft space between friendship and something more profound. And of course, there were stories of people who chose not to marry. The midwife who lived alone in a small cottage at the edge of the woods, welcomed into every home but never tied to one. The merchant who said, "I've already got enough to carry. Why add a husband?" The baker who once had a fiancée, but after his death, never loved again. In a world where marriage was expected, these choices stood out. But they weren't always judged harshly. Sometimes they were quietly respected. Not everyone needed a partner to live a meaningful life. These unexpected marriages and non-marriages reminded people that life didn't always follow the rules. And sometimes the best stories came from the ones who didn't do things the usual way. Whether you were married under a church bell or beneath a walnut tree, what mattered most wasn't the setting, ceremony, or even the priest's approval. It was how you treated the person beside you, day in, day out. In good years and lean ones, through harsh winters and small joys. With kindness, with stubbornness, and, if you were lucky, with laughter. In medieval villages, privacy was more of a concept than a reality. Houses had thin walls, if any at all. Gossip moved faster than fire, and once you were married, your relationship wasn't just between 2 people. It was part of the community's ecosystem. That meant your marriage was everyone's business. Not in a nosy way, well, sometimes nosy, but because marriages affected how households ran, how children were raised, and how the village functioned. If a couple argued loudly enough, the neighbors heard it. People noticed if someone stormed out and slammed a wooden door, which took effort because most doors creaked more than slammed. And if the goat came wandering into the lane alone, villagers quietly wondered who forgot to latch the pen and why. Disagreements were expected. No one thought marriage was a storybook. But repeated conflict? That raised eyebrows. A husband who shouted too much might get pulled aside by an elder. A wife who suddenly stopped showing up at the market might receive a quiet visit from a neighbor with a basket of apples and a few gentle questions. It wasn't formal policing, it was social accountability. Every village had its way of handling disputes. Sometimes elders mediated. Sometimes a local priest offered advice, or at least a firm look. In certain regions, there were love courts, where community members gathered to hear complaints between spouses. These weren't legal courts, but more like guided conversations, with everyone watching. Imagine explaining to half your neighbors why you won't speak to your wife because she burned the bread 3 times this week. That alone made many husbands rethink their approach. Public shaming was rare, but it happened. A man who struck his wife might be shunned or made to sit outside the church as a form of penance. A woman who repeatedly insulted her husband in public might be called before the village council. It wasn't about punishment, it was about keeping the peace. And in tight-knit communities, peace mattered more than pride. On the flip side, good marriages were noticed too. People talked about the couple who always worked side by side in the field, the wife who shared extra soup with her neighbor, or the husband who always ensured the chickens were penned before dark so his wife wouldn't trip over them. Children watched these marriages. So did the unmarried. And slowly, the village built an informal blueprint for what a decent union looked like. Not perfect, not flashy, but steady. Among the nobility, things were more complex. A troubled marriage between lords and ladies could affect alliances, land, and politics. Disputes were handled more privately, behind heavy doors, with letters sent to bishops or kings. But word still got out. Servants talked, messengers gossiped. Soon the entire region might know that the Earl of Somewhere hadn't spoken to his wife since she had insulted his falcon in front of guests. Public image mattered. Noble couples often maintained appearances in public, even if things were cold behind the scenes. At feasts, they sat side by side. At church, they stood together. Whether they smiled was optional. Interestingly, marriage wasn't just about two people and property. Land, tools, animals, even blankets. In peasant marriages, these things were shared. Arguments about who brought what into the marriage sometimes bubbled up, especially if things went wrong. "That was my cow," someone might say. "Well, I fixed the barn," came the reply. The village often stepped in with wisdom, saying, "The cow doesn't care who owns it, just milk it. And if you both keep arguing, I'll take the cow and neither of you will have it." Despite the occasional clash, most villages found balance. Married life wasn't expected to be perfect, but it was expected to endure. People helped each other. They reminded young couples that winter always feels longer the first year, that goats always escape when you need sleep, and that nobody makes good stew on the first try. And so, your marriage became part of the social fabric. When you argued, the village listened. When you made up, the town smiled quietly. When you stumbled, someone handed you a broom or a loaf of bread and said, "Try again tomorrow." Because in the medieval world, marriage wasn't a private matter. It was a shared investment in survival, tradition, and the hope that two people could build something steady even when the roof leaked and the chickens were loud. In medieval times, no one asked married couples, "So when are you planning to have kids?" Because the answer was immediate and straightforward. As soon as a couple exchanged vows, the expectation of children arrived right alongside the wedding bread and leftover stew. Having children wasn't just a milestone, it was part of the job description. In most villages, children meant help. They weren't just bundles of joy, they were future hands for planting, gathering, spinning, and feeding the animals. The earlier they arrived, the better, at least in theory. There was no, "we're waiting until we're more stable." Stability was rare. Children came when they came, and everyone adjusted. Women were often pregnant within the first year of marriage. It was expected. Whispers began when a couple reached 2 or 3 years without a child. It was not harsh initially, but people noticed. Elders offered herbal remedies. Midwives muttered about timing and diet. And occasionally, someone quietly asked if the couple had consummated properly. Yes, that was a thing. Fertility was deeply tied to how people saw marriage. A wife who bore children quickly was considered blessed. A husband with a growing family was seen as prosperous, even if he only had 2 coins to rub together. But childbirth wasn't easy or safe. There were no hospitals, no prenatal vitamins, and no guaranteed help. Women gave birth at home, often with the assistance of a midwife, a female relative, or just the neighbor who'd been through it 5 times herself. Some labors lasted hours, some ended too soon. Every successful birth was a quiet miracle. The first child was a huge event. Neighbors brought bread, herbs, or a clean piece of cloth. The midwife was paid with whatever the family could spare. Sometimes food, wool, and thanks. and the baby's baptism followed quickly, usually within days. This wasn't just about faith. Infant mortality was high. Baptism was seen as a spiritual safeguard, and the church insisted it be done early. Godparents were chosen carefully. They weren't just symbolic. They might one day raise the child if something happened to the parents. It wasn't uncommon for a brother, cousin, or close neighbor to become a godparent. It was an honor, but also a responsibility. After the baptism, a small meal was shared. Nothing grand, but enough to say, this child is part of us now. As children grew, they became woven into daily life. A toddler might toddle through the garden while the mother worked. A child of 6 could gather eggs. By 10, they might herd animals or run errands. And while children weren't burdened, they weren't babied either. Life was busy. If a child could help, they did. If they cried, someone handed them bread. If they fell, someone said, "You're fine," and pointed them back to the task. Among noble families, children were raised with more ceremony, but the expectations were the same. A son was expected to inherit land, titles, or a position. A daughter was often prepared for marriage by 12 or 13. Noble boys were taught to read, hunt, and manage people. Noble girls learned to sew, speak politely, and survive formal dinners without spilling stew on expensive sleeves. But even in castles, babies still cried at night. Mothers were still worried. Fathers still tripped over wooden toys left near the hearth. Sadly, not all children survived. Illness, cold, and malnutrition claimed many young lives. Having 6 or 7 children and seeing only half reach adulthood was common. But each life, however brief, was cherished, grieved, remembered. A small wooden carving, a favorite lullaby hummed long after the child had gone. Even in a time used to hardship, loss never became routine. For couples, children brought change. More chores, more worries, more laughter, the first giggle, the first steps are across a dirt floor. The first time a child said, "Mama" or "Papa" while holding a sticky hand. It was exhausting, but it gave meaning to long winters and endless days of work. And as the years passed, a household grew noisier, busier, and fuller. Shoes lined up at the door, extra bowls at the table, a baby in the sling, a toddler underfoot, and someone always asking where the bread went. In those moments, messy, loud, chaotic, many couples found a deeper rhythm. Not romance as we define it today, but something steadier. Partnership, purpose, and pride in what they were building together. In the Middle Ages, if you made it to old age with your spouse still beside you, that alone was remarkable. Illness, accidents, childbirth, war, and winter could take people quickly. Life expectancy was low, not because people didn't age well, but because getting through your 30s in one piece was already a feat. So when 2 people grew old together, it wasn't just rare, it was quietly celebrated. An elderly couple in a medieval village didn't hold hands publicly or call each other sweet nicknames. But their connection showed in different ways. The way they worked in silence, already knowing what the other needed. The way she stirred his soup without asking if he was hungry. The way he laid his cloak over the bench before she sat down. They weren't flashy, they were steady. As they aged, their roles shifted. The husband no longer swung the axe as high, but he could still mend tools and offer advice about planting. The wife might leave the heavy lifting to younger arms, but her knowledge of herbs, weather, and people grew sharper than ever. They became the ones others turned to, not because they had power, but because they had seen enough to know what mattered. Their home was a living timeline, a wall with old tools hanging neatly. A shelf with cups is given at their wedding. A stool was repaired 3 times, but it is still sturdy. Children came and went. Grandchildren, if they were lucky, sat at their feet asking about the olden days, which in truth were only 20 or 30 winters ago. Elderly couples weren't expected to attend every wedding or feast anymore, but their presence still mattered. When they did show up, people made room. Someone always fetched a chair. Someone poured the first mug of ale in their honor. Because those who stayed married into old age carried the quiet proof that love wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just continuing. And of course, not every old couple had an easy path. There were losses, fights, long winters when nothing grew and tempers frayed. But they stayed. Sometimes out of duty, sometimes out of habit. Often simply because they couldn't imagine life without the other. They might sit together in the evenings with no words exchanged for hours. Not in silence, but in comfort. The quiet you don't need to fill. Neighbors noticed. They saw how he cut her bread a little thinner because she didn't chew well anymore. The way she reminded him, gently, that his left boot always needed tightening. Sometimes they still laughed at things no one else understood. Children thought it was magic. Adults knew it was an effort. Among the nobility, elderly couples were rarer but still respected. A nobleman who remained married to his lady for decades was admired, especially if he hadn't remarried after her passing. His loyalty became legend. Her wisdom became sought after. And if they both lived long enough to see their grandchildren inherit titles or lands, they were treated with reverence, like walking relics of a more grounded time. Old love in the medieval world wasn't poetic. It was practical, built on years of shared mornings, burdens, and silence. It was built on walking through a storm together and coming out on the other side muddy and tired, but still holding the same tattered cloak over each other's shoulders. And the village noticed the change when one passed before the other, which happened more often than not. The empty chair by the fire, the pause in someone's routine. The bread baked for two is now eaten alone. Widowhood was difficult, not just emotionally but practically. Losing a spouse meant losing help, companionship, and often security. But it also meant carrying the memory of a life built from scratch. One stew, one winter, one quiet evening at a time. Sometimes the surviving spouse remarries. Sometimes they didn't. But the first marriage stayed with them, in habits, in favorite songs, in how they tied bundles of herbs just like they always used to. In modern times, anniversaries come with flowers, candlelit dinners, and maybe a handwritten note left beside a breakfast tray. In medieval times, if you remembered your anniversary at all, and you weren't too busy shearing sheep or fighting off a cough, you were already ahead of the curve. There was no tradition of annual celebrations. No one expected a feast every July 14th because that's the day you got married 5 years ago. Most couples didn't mark the date at all. They remembered the season, the weather, the feeling of that day, not the number on the calendar. In the medieval world, survival was a full-time job, and harvests, not Hallmark, moved time. But that didn't mean anniversaries were meaningless. They just looked different. Some couples quietly noted the day with a shared loaf of bread. A pause in the evening chores, a memory murmured by the fire. Do you remember the way my mother spilled cider on the priest's foot that day? And a chuckle, that was enough. Other times the community remembered them. An older neighbor might nod and say, 7 winters since your vows, eh? A midwife might mention, I remember your first was born the year after. Strong lungs, that one. Anniversaries were less about numbers and more about moments woven into shared life fabric. In rare cases, especially among the wealthy, milestone anniversaries were marked with ceremony. A noble couple married for 25 years might host a modest feast, not to show off, but to thank those who had supported them. Servants who had stayed through thick and thin. Tenants who had weathered brutal winters. Children have grown and now have families of their own. A priest might offer a renewed blessing. A scribe might draft a short verse in honor of their lasting union. Not a poem exactly. Just a few lines, written in good faith and read aloud before the bread was served. But even among peasants, long marriages were quietly admired. People said they've lasted through 3 bad harvests and still smile at each other. Or she still gives him the bigger slice of bread. That was the medieval equivalent of a gold medal. And when a couple passed 10, 20, 30 years together, they became a village landmark. The kids who once danced at their wedding now have their own kids. The wooden spoon gifted on their wedding day might still be used, chipped, worn smooth, but still stirring the pot every evening. Even without formal celebration, some couples found their own ways to mark time. A husband might bring home a better cut of meat if he could find one. A wife might patch up her husband's old tunic and leave it folded on his stool, neatly mended. No declarations, just gestures. One couple might sit by the river where they first walked together. Another might light an extra candle at church and say a prayer, not just for their health, but for patience, which they agreed was always harder to keep. And sometimes anniversaries passed without notice. Too many things to do, too many mouths to feed. But even then, something lingered. A glance, a memory, a feeling of having shared another year, even if it looked like every other one. Because in truth, the medieval idea of commitment wasn't about marking dates. It was about showing up, every day, in rain and sun, through colds and lean seasons and goats that kept breaking the fence. It was a quiet kind of loyalty, one that didn't need a celebration to be real. For some, the best anniversary gift was simply another day together. Another bowl of soup was shared. Another roof kept patched. Another moment where there was still space for kindness, despite the noise, work and weather. Sometimes, in a world that demands so much, love looks like passing the better half of your bread to someone else without being asked. When people today think about marriage, love usually comes first, then the house, the chores, and everything else. But in the medieval world, love wasn't always the foundation. Many marriages began without it. Arranged marriages were common, not just among nobles, but among peasants too. A father knew another family had a good patch of land. A mother heard that someone's son had strong hands and steady manners. Conversations were had. Hands were shaken, and just like that, a match was made. No roses, no long walks. Just logic. For the couple involved, this often meant getting married to someone they barely knew. Sometimes they'd spoken once or twice. Sometimes they hadn't. But the expectation was clear: build a life, work together, raise children, and make it last. Love grew slowly, like ivy on stone if it came at all. At first, these marriages could feel awkward. Two strangers share a bed, a pot, and a small space. He chewed too loudly. She folded his shirts the wrong way. Neither said much. They were polite, careful, waiting to see who the other person was. But over time, something shifted. Maybe she noticed how he always made sure the chickens were fed before sitting down to eat. Perhaps he realized she hummed the same tune every morning while sweeping the floor. Little things. Quiet things. The kind that didn't spark poems, but built trust. The fire wasn't always warm, but it didn't go out. There were also marriages that never quite warmed up. Two people who coexisted. They did their duties, raised children, paid taxes, and spoke only when necessary. Not unkindly, just distantly. Affection never bloomed, but neither did cruelty. These unions weren't failed, they just never deepened. And in some cases that was enough, because in a world where hunger and cold were more urgent than feelings, emotional fulfillment wasn't always the priority. Stability was. Then there were couples where love bloomed late, perhaps after the first child, or after a bad harvest when they held each other for comfort, or after a long illness when one nursed the other patiently without complaint. These moments chipped away at the distance between them. One day he brought her a handful of wildflowers. Not because it was her birthday, just because. She smiled, and something shifted. They might not call it love, but they started waiting for each other before meals. That said, enough. Among the nobility, marriages without love were the norm. A duchess might be betrothed at 12 to a man twice her age. To secure land, a young lord might marry a woman he'd never met. These unions were contracts, not courtships. Some remained cold forever. Others became surprisingly warm over time. And occasionally, people fell in love with someone else entirely, but stayed in the marriage because there was no way out. It was painful, but accepted. Despite these realities, people still dreamed of love. Songs were sung, stories were told of knights, maidens, and soulmates who found each other across battlefields or ballrooms. These tales didn't match reality, but gave people something to imagine. Sometimes a wife looked at her husband and wondered if love might still come. Sometimes it did. Sometimes a husband looked at his wife and realized, after 20 years and 5 children, that he didn't just admire her, he loved her. Quietly, steadily. And sometimes people made peace with what they had. They might not be in love, but they were kind to each other. They laughed when the goat escaped again. They shared chores. They remembered which herbs the other didn't like in their stew. And when one was sick, the other stayed up all night tending the fire. Was that love? Maybe. Maybe not, but it was enough to stay, because in medieval times, love wasn't always loud. It wasn't expected. It wasn't even always named. But when it showed up, late, soft, unannounced, it was treasured like a candle that kept burning even in the wind. Even in medieval times, when marriages were often practical arrangements and love wasn't always expected, jealousy existed. Human nature didn't wait for modern romance to evolve. It crept into doorways, peeked across market stalls, and stirred trouble behind church pews. Yes, jealousy was alive and well without dating apps or dramatic love triangles. Among peasants, most marriages were based on survival, not passion. But that didn't stop people from noticing when a husband lingered too long, chatting with the widow who baked good bread. Or when a wife smiled too brightly at the new shepherd who played the flute on Sundays. Was it always something serious? Did it get people talking? Absolutely. Villages were small. Nothing stayed secret for long. If someone strayed, it wasn't just a private matter, but the whole community's entertainment. I saw her walking near the stream with that tanner again, someone might whisper. Well, maybe she just likes leather, came the reply, followed by raised eyebrows and knowing nods. It didn't take much for suspicion to grow. The church, of course, had strong opinions. Adultery was considered a grave sin. It was preached against from the pulpit and punished severely when proven. A man caught with another man's wife might face fines, flogging, or public penance. A woman could be shamed, cast out, or worse, especially if she became pregnant. But despite the rules, it still happened. Some affairs were brief and clumsy. A stolen kiss behind the stable, a few late nights pretending to check on the animals. Others lasted years, carefully hidden but never quite invisible. People had reasons: loneliness, curiosity, kindness that turned into something more. But no excuse ever softened the fallout if it was discovered. Because in a world where survival depended on reputation and trust, betrayal cut deep. Jealousy didn't always mean infidelity had occurred. Sometimes it was just a look, a suspicion, a long silence at dinner followed by slightly louder than usual stew stirring. Wives noticed when husbands came home smelling of someone else's stew. Husbands noticed when wives suddenly wore their best scarves to the market on a Tuesday. Confrontations were often quiet but sharp. You've been friendly with the brewer's daughter, a wife might say, not looking up. She pours heavy, he might answer, shrugging. So does the roof. Go fix it, she'd reply. And just like that, the air got colder. Some couples argued, then moved on. Others let resentment stew for years. But most understood one thing clearly. If things fell apart at home, the village would know and judge. While the church preached against sin, the community delivered the real consequences. A man known to wander might find himself left off the next planting crew. A woman with rumors swirling might find fewer neighbors willing to help when the firewood runs out. Social punishment was subtle, but effective. Among nobles, infidelity was more complicated. Noblemen often had mistresses, sometimes openly. While technically frowned upon, it was usually tolerated, so long as the wife wasn't publicly humiliated. A lady who caused a scandal by reacting too strongly might be blamed for overreacting rather than the husband for straying. Noblewomen, on the other hand, had far less freedom. A woman caught in adultery faced harsh consequences: loss of status, separation from her children, or worse. Even if her marriage had been arranged and loveless, she was still expected to remain loyal. Still, history holds whispers of noblewomen who defied expectations. Letters, glances, poems tucked into sleeves. And the consequences, when they came, were swift and silent. But not every moment of jealousy led to disaster. Some couples worked through it, talked, even if it was awkward, re-established boundaries. Or give it time until the tension fades like mist after rain. There wasn't therapy. There weren't books about communication styles. But there was daily life, shared, stubborn, and full of moments that demanded cooperation. When the stew had to be made, the goat had to be milked, and the roof was leaking, there wasn't always room for long grudges. Many chose to move forward, not because they forgot, but because they had no choice. And sometimes jealousy wasn't about infidelity at all. It was about attention, feeling unseen and being tired while the other seemed carefree. A husband envied how easily his wife laughed with neighbors. A wife feels hurt that her husband praised someone else's bread but said nothing about hers. These moments too were real, and quietly resolved, or quietly endured. In the Middle Ages, no relationship books, couples counselors, or 10 tips to keep the spark alive scrolls existed. But that didn't mean people got married and just stumbled through unthinkingly. No advice was everywhere. It came from your mother, your neighbor, the older woman who'd been married so long that no one remembered her maiden name. And sometimes from the village blacksmith who'd seen enough weddings and arguments to qualify as a part-time philosopher. The most common advice: marriage is like tending a fire. You don't just light it once and expect it to keep burning. You feed it, watch it, adjust the logs. Sometimes you poke it with a stick, and sometimes you step back so it doesn't burn your eyebrows off. Not poetic, but accurate. Older women, especially grandmothers and midwives, offered wisdom that mixed practicality with dry humor. Don't go to bed angry. Unless you're too tired, then do it and fix it over breakfast. Keep his belly full and his boots dry. Never trust a man who compliments your neighbor's goat more than your bread. And most famously, if he wants to argue while you're stirring the pot, hand him the spoon. Men gave advice too, though it was often less wordy. The village carpenter once said, "Don't marry someone who won't help you lift a beam." The shepherd said, "You don't need to speak the same way, just pull in the same direction." And the blacksmith, who'd been married 3 times, summed it up with, "Sharpen your tools, not your tongue." They weren't trying to be poets, just honest. Some advice was passed down through stories, like the tale of a wife who never spoke ill of her husband, not because he was perfect, but because she believed, if I say it, others will believe it. And if others believe it, he'll start acting like it's true. Or the story of the husband who always walked behind his wife on muddy roads, not because he was chivalrous, but because he knew she'd spot puddles better. These little tales made the rounds, told beside fires, during harvest breaks, or over stew. They were simple, but they stuck. Churches also offered their version of marriage guidance. Priests reminded couples of their duties, fidelity, patience, and shared devotion. Husbands were told to love their wives as Christ loved the church, which sounded deeply profound or vaguely terrifying, depending on the priest's tone. Wives were told to be obedient, but most women nodded politely and carried on making decisions anyway. Everyone knew sermons didn't always match reality. In many villages, newlyweds received small blessings from elders. May your arguments be short and your winters mild. May your roof hold, and may your bed never be empty unless by choice. May you forget small slights quickly and remember who patched your cloak when it rained. These weren't grand pronouncements, just quiet hopes, spoken with a nod and maybe a loaf of bread. Some couples carved their own rules as they went. One might agree never to speak when angry. Another decided to take turns choosing whose family to visit each holy day. A third couple held hands every time they fought. It was hard to shout when your fingers were still touching. Not all advice works for everyone, but most agreed on this. Say thank you often. Say sorry when it matters, and never forget to share the last piece of cheese. Children listened too. Even when they were pretending not to, they heard how their parents spoke to each other, how disagreements were handled. Whether laughter returned to the room after a silence, those lessons lasted longer than any official ceremony. Many children grew up and repeated the same advice, or improved it, or ignored it, until the first time their spouse forgot to salt the stew and they realized, maybe grandma was onto something. And so marriage advice in the Middle Ages wasn't written in books. It was baked into the bread, woven into the blankets, hidden in a wink from a woman stirring soup who'd seen it all before. And while the advice wasn't always elegant, it was lived. In medieval villages, a marriage wasn't just a private agreement between two people. It was a public contract, a social event, and in many ways, a community project. Because when you got married, you didn't just marry your spouse. You married into their family, their neighbors, their customs, their quirks. And yes, sometimes even their goats. From the beginning, the village played a role. They helped build the house, cooked for the wedding and loaned blankets, offered bread and watched the ceremony, and later whispered about the stew or the groom's nervous stutter. But they carried chairs, swept up crumbs, and ensured someone fed the dog. Even people who didn't smile much still showed up, because a wedding reminded everyone we are all connected. And that connection didn't stop after the feast. If the couple needed help fixing a roof, someone brought nails. If firewood ran low, someone left a bundle by the door. If the wife fell ill after childbirth, neighbors brought broth and herbs or sat quietly to let her rest. It wasn't charity, it was survival, woven together with kindness. But the village didn't just support, it was also watched. They noticed if the husband drank too much. Suppose the wife seemed too quiet. Suppose the baby cried for too long. Not in a cruel way, usually, but because keeping an eye on each other was how problems were prevented. People stepped in, offered advice, gently nudged. Sometimes it was helpful, sometimes it wasn't enjoyable, but it meant you were never truly alone. Marriage also meant new roles within the village. A young couple might be invited to help with festivals, planting rituals, or watch over children during feast days. The wife might be asked to join the weaving circle. The husband might be pulled into fence repairs, even if he wasn't good at it. Participation meant belonging, and when children came along, the web grew wider. Neighbors helped with feeding, watching, teaching, and scolding. If a child misbehaves, the baker might raise an eyebrow before the parents notice. If a child showed talent, singing, drawing, storytelling, someone mentioned, nudged, nurtured it. The whole village raised them. Not just the parents. The sense of community among nobles looked different, but it was still there. A noble marriage linked not just two people, but estates, families, and political alliances. It affected taxes, land rights, and military obligations. When a noble couple married, the entire region shifted slightly. Tenants waited to see if the new lady of the manor would be kind. Servants whispered guesses about her habits. Local leaders sent gifts or spies. Still, the household itself was a small community. Dozens of people under one roof, working, eating, and surviving together. And the marriage's success often influenced the whole estate's tone. In smaller towns and rural hamlets, marriages were even more deeply rooted in the community's rhythm. They weren't isolated events. They were markers of time. The year of Anna's wedding was the year of the early frost. We built that barn 2 winters after Thomas and Lise married. Remember when they danced under the oak tree after the wedding? That tree fell just last spring. Memories were tied to couples, and couples became part of the village's living history. And if a marriage endured through children, hardship, and time, it became something everyone felt proud of. Like a tree that withstood every storm and still gave shade. Newlyweds might ask for advice. Young people looked at old couples and wondered quietly, how did they do it? And the answer, though never written down, echoed in how they moved, worked, and sat side by side in the evening stillness. When one partner passed away, the village mourned, truly. Not just for the person lost, but for the partnership, the shared routines, and how two people created something stable in an unstable world. Neighbors helped, brought meals, sat in silence. When ready, gently fill the space with presence, not pressure. In medieval times, marriage was a thread in the fabric of village life. And when two people tied their lives together, they weren't just starting a household, they were weaving themselves into the story of a place. And that story would carry on. Through songs, through footsteps, through the way someone still hung herbs the same way her mother once did, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from the neighbor's aunt, who got married under the willow tree by the stream. We often consider medieval weddings grand affairs, flower crowns, church bells, embroidered tunics, and dancing beneath the stars. And yes, sometimes they were precisely that, but more often they were something far quieter, more grounded, less about spectacle, and more about stitching two lives together, one careful thread at a time. No one expected perfection. They hoped for decency, for cooperation, for someone to share a roof with when it leaked, and a laugh with when the fire finally caught on a cold morning. Marriage in the medieval world was many things. It was a promise whispered in front of neighbors and God. It was learning to sleep beside someone who snored or stole blankets. It was watching stew bubble slowly while your spouse patched boots nearby. It was the rhythm of doing life together, even when life wasn't poetic. The ceremony marked the start, yes, but it wasn't the marriage. The marriage was in the in-between, in the way a couple moved around a tiny home without bumping into each other too much. They argued, forgave, and remembered to fetch the herbs the other liked. In the compromises, no one clapped for. In the patience, no one saw. There was joy, of course, new babies, quiet mornings, a loaf of bread baked just right, moments when laughter cracked open a hard week like sunlight through shutters, days when everything went wrong, rain, lost keys, burnt stew. But still, one look across the table made it all a little better. That kind of love didn't make it into poems, but it lasted longer, and it wasn't always love either. Some marriages were arranged, practical, stubborn. They took work, took time. Sometimes they never quite softened. But they held, and in a world that asked so much from people, holding on was more than enough. Others grew tender with age. Two people who started as strangers and decades later couldn't imagine folding laundry without each other. That kind of bond didn't need big words. It lived in the silences. Yes, there were challenges, infidelity, misunderstandings, loss. But there was also a community, elders with advice, neighbors who helped repair roofs, and relationships, children who reminded their parents why it all mattered. And even when love wasn't loud, it often showed up quietly, in a mended sock, in a reheated bowl of soup, waiting for someone who came home late, not to scold, but to say, "I saved you some bread." As years passed, couples became part of their village's story. Their marriage wasn't an event anymore, it was a foundation, a fire that kept burning. Sometimes dimly, sometimes fiercely, but always there. They became the ones others looked to, not because they were perfect, but because they kept going. And in the end, that was the real magic. So no, medieval marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was muddy boots and patched roofs. It was dried herbs hanging beside the door. "I'll do the washing if you fetch the water." It was ordinary, repetitive, beautiful in its way. And maybe that kind of love lasts the longest. Not because it burned brightest, but because it knew how to stay warm through the longest winters. Now, as the story winds down and your eyes grow heavier, picture this: a small wooden home at the edge of a village. Smoke curls gently from the chimney. Inside, a couple sits close by the fire, not talking much, just existing together in silence from years of shared weather, laughter, and life. Outside, the stars blink gently. Inside, the bread is warm. And everything, just for this moment, is enough. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the quiet, humble marriages of the Middle Ages. If you feel even more at ease tonight, I'm glad to have played a small part in your rest. Sleep well. And if you enjoyed this sleepy journey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know where you're listening from. We'll meet again in another story, on another night. But for now, good night.